Mm-hmm. 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 Hello, hello, hello. Test, test, test. Hi there, my name is SHAZZBARBARIC, and this is Reading the Times for Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. As one of my audience members pointed out, this is not November 2nd, it's November 6th, Saturday, November 6th. We're catching up. By Monday, we should have caught up to Monday, and then we'll be doing the day's news. I've gotten some feedback so far from my early supporters, some positive, some constructive criticism. But it's going to be a daily news show where I read the New York Times every day, but I summarize it. So that way it's only an hour, hour and a half, but you get the whole New York Times, at least what's worth reading in the New York Times. And then we're going to add commentary. Every week we will comment on the stories we get. And then we are going to compare those with reality and see what we are not talking about, what we should actually be talking about. That is the goal. That is the point as I run for Congress. So the big story, the big goal here is me, SHAZZBARBARIC, born and raised in Los Angeles, just outside Los Angeles. Am running for Congress in the Bay Area. Why the Bay Area? Why Monterey Bay, Santa Cruz, Monterey, Big Sur, that whole Northern California coast? Well, that's where Shaz joined the Army. 18 years old, I was recruited into military intelligence. Now I'm 39, so that's 21 years ago. We're going to look at what's happened in the world in those 21 years, where Shaz could have gone. I could be an intelligence analyst right now. What would I be doing? I'd be supporting the American empire. In 2000, I joined. In 2002, I got out. In 2003, we went to Iraq. Some of my friends and family members went to Iraq. A couple of them are 100% disabled now. Some others are no longer with us. This was widely accepted to be a war of aggression. Wars of aggression are the highest crime. The Nuremberg trials, in which we prosecuted the Nazis. The Nuremberg trials stated that wars of aggression are the highest crime of the land because they are the crime that includes all others. The rapes, the pillaging, the murders. That's where most of our money's going right now, to the American empire, to these wars of aggression. So we have to start throwing people in jail. Do we have to start killing people? I don't know. What is that? Capital punishment? That is how the military does it. If you commit military crimes, you face martial punishment. But that is not up to me to decide. I just would like to bring these people accountable. There's a lot of other people who would too. A lot of other people who it bugs us that we've lived through such a period of injustice without accountability. This is the beginning of that accountability. Politics grounded in objective reality. So this is the ground sign for electricity with an F and a P added onto it. Flash politics, or the friendship party. Get out there, talk to each other, make friends, figure out what the fuck is going on. So get out there, talk to each other, make friends, and together we can define objective reality. This is something that Julian Assange, remember him? Julian Assange, he's in prison in America, even though he's not an American citizen, because he leaked documents, even though he wasn't the one who leaked them. He was just a publisher. Someone gave him documents showing that America's war of aggression in Iraq is actually being carried out in the most barbaric of ways, sending out lists of middle class and normal citizens to assassinate what we did in Latin America, the death squads, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Indonesia, when Barack Obama was living there. Interesting, right? As a child. The CIA, American intelligence, gives these countries lists of people that they should kill. Hundreds of thousands, millions, who knows? Barack Obama himself says that the bean counters in the CIA lose track of how many people they ask these countries to kill. But they do ask them to kill them, because when you take over a country, you not only have to destroy their infrastructure, remove the dictator that you previously were supporting because he's no longer useful. That's one of the quotes from Iraq. They said the master has called back his dog and now he's come himself. The people on the street usually figure out instinctually what's going on. You could just see the energies moving. In Russia, they would say, do not believe anything the Russian government tells you about itself, but everything it tells you about America. Because you have to discern the. So in Iraq, they know Saddam was a bad guy, but they also knew that he was doing America's bidding for the most part. The CIA put him in power. And they're the ones who asked him to kill the previous leader. He failed. And then they're the ones who took him out of the country to protect him, as we are known to do, protect dictators we like. And then he only was in power as long as he had our support. As soon as he lost it, we went there ourselves, right? How could we ever say we were liberating Iraq when, right when we got there, we began construction of the largest embassy in the world? It's not an embassy. Where was that embassy located? Where is it located? In the green zone, in the fortified compound of the dictator himself. Literally, we replaced the dictator with thousands of our own State Department employees. So instead of one dictator, now we just have a bureaucracy. Isn't that the metaphor for the modern American empire? We've moved from one controlling dictator or strongman to groups of bureaucracy, which we institute in order to run countries. I mean, don't get me wrong, we still pay strongmen to run countries. In Libya, our current chess piece in Libya is a guy called General Hifter. Who is this man? A man who owns property in Connecticut. He owns property a short distance from the CIA headquarters. And I have to figure out my geography. Is that Virginia, Connecticut? In that general area. We know this because the people he tortures, the people that this strongman, this warlord, openly described as a warlord, openly described as our man in Libya after we helped overthrow. Who was that? What president helped overthrow Libya? That was Barack Obama, the black president. Helped overthrow the black leader of the African nation with a high standard of living. And then they'll say, no, but he was a dictator. No, he was a strong man. Well, how's the game being played? The only people who stand up to America are people who concentrate their power in their country. Am I defending a dictator? No, I'm defending people's right for self-determination, which is very hard when you have this American empire going around the world claiming ownership over everything, claiming control over everything. What are we going to do? We're going to promote peace. We're going to promote peace at home. We're going to promote peace abroad by grounding politics in objective reality. Stop having a discussion where we leave out important bits of information. Barack Obama, he's first black president. He's a great guy. Look at all of his actions. What does he do? And then compare those thoughts, words, and actions. What does he do compared to what does he say? Compared to what are his values? What does he think? And then get out with each other in public and political party, friendship party, and let's figure this out. But with all the facts. That is the scientific method. That's why we're grounding it in objective reality, because this approach is the only scientific approach. Every other approach is just pure power politics. They're gangs. The Republican Party, the Democrat Party. These are gangs of power. They operate like gangs. You join them, you get jumped in through their indoctrination, and you only remain through loyalty to power. That's why Joseph Biden, was he the most qualified? No, he was the most powerful. And then who lined up in order to give him service and and say, oh, yeah, okay, he's the guy. We're on your team. Is all those people also only worship power, right? And what did they get for the loyalty? Well, let's see. Buddy Gig gets to transportation post. So now he's the chief transportation guy in the United States. I think the mayor of Los Angeles is getting an ambassadorship to India. Everyone, just if you line up and you serve the power interest of your political gang, you're rewarded, right? Barack Obama, his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel. Well, he got to run for the mayor of Chicago 2 terms. How's Chicago doing? These political guys, these political leaders, how are the people doing? How is America doing after Barack Obama? He came in to do what? To bail out the banks, right? And then he brags on, well, no, we paid back the money we loaned the banks. But why didn't you help us, Americans at the bottom? My folks lost their house during the 2008 crisis. They lost their house. Bank of America said they were going to modify their mortgage. They didn't. They said they were going to. And during that process, they were foreclosed upon and they lost their house. They had to rent a room from a funny lady she was nice, but a funny lady on Craigslist. But all of us have been suffering. All of us have been asking our government to do what governments are supposed to do, which is represent the people. But instead, we have corporations who control the governments, who perpetuate these endless wars, which are very profitable. After we invaded Iraq, after I should have gone, but Shaz being an anti-authoritarian, luckily I sidestepped that. My friends and family weren't so lucky. So after we spilled blood for $20,000 a year, right? My job in Iraq would have paid me, actually, an E1, E2 is like only $14,000, $16,000 a year. In the private industry, that same job would have been $150,000, $180,000 a year, right? So we're transferring money from the public treasury to private pockets. And there's documentaries about that, how much money was actually transferred. I mean, what is it up to, like a couple trillion now? A couple trillion for these wars that create more terrorism, that create that they keep saying are endless. It's like, once we start, now these are endless wars, right? What did Afghanistan do for the average American person? What did Iraq? And then is this not the old gang mentality? When we question it and when we say, you know, I don't think these wars are a good idea. I think maybe we could have done there's a better use of that time and that money. And then they say, but then you might die if you don't give us this money for our endless wars of aggression. Something bad might happen to you. I have Barack Obama. He's talking to Bill Maher. And that's what I'm surprised that this has gone on so long, this charade of con artists getting us to do these endless wars so that way their corporations can profit for the stock, which a 1% of America owns. And then the rest of us are following the stock market as if we bought tickets to the dog race. We're just watching it. And then like the richest people are actually watching it go up and down. We saw that with the pandemic, right? The stock market is going crazy. Mainstream, they say over half small businesses are going to close. So many of my restaurants I love in New York, over here in California, have been closing during the pandemic. But the stock market's been going crazy. Paper profits are through the roof. But the real economy, so the stock market's been unhinged from the real economy for a while, right? If it ever was connected. But then they say, yeah, so I'm surprised that this charade has gone on for so long when we have the documented record. Well, that's why we're having a war on the internet. We're not going to have a documented record. As soon as they can shut it down, they're using the excuse of children and this and that, but it's censorship. They would like to shut down the internet as soon as possible. That was a Democrat who said that, a Rockefeller. I wonder what his family's business is in. But he was like, yeah, I wish the internet wasn't invented, actually. Too much information. People are too informed. So, yeah, Barack Obama, and then I'll stop 15 minutes and we'll get into this. I have to get out of here in an hour. But Barack Obama was like, Bill Maher was like, early into his term. And Bill Maher, he claims that he speaks truth, right? He's a bit of an idiot, but he's one of the most independent voices we're allowed to have. He was like, Barack, don't you think it's too much war? Don't you think we should stop these idiot imperial wars? He called them the American Empire. He said, Barack, what's up with the American Empire? And Barack was like, most of these generals don't want war, which is against the historic record. That's all they know is war. I mean, I do that too. You have to look up the history of our staff. Anyways, that's military history, but how we got to the current command structure in the military and why these people are so addicted to war. because staff officers are removed from the field. So there's a certain breed of idiots. But Bill Maher was like, yeah, American empire, maybe we should slow it down a little bit, hold back. I mean, we have our country's falling apart. Maybe we should stop fighting wars, voluntary wars. And Barack is like, these guys don't want war, actually. And my biggest fear is a terrorist attack on the homeland, a mushroom cloud in New York City. That's what they do. You get too close to threatening their power, and they bring up that whole it's what is that, protection racket, right? Don't question me too much because something bad might happen to you, right? This is for your protection, right? Isn't that what also abusive parents, abusive relationships do? I love you. I love you. I love you. I hit you because I love you. I hurt you because I love you. I protect you. Without me, you'd be lost, right? Democrats. Okay, one last one. Michelle Obama last year telling people, you got to vote for Biden. You got to. I mean, let's not look at his creepy past. Let's not look at his corporatist history. Let's not look at the fact that he's a ghost of a leader, right? Like falling asleep in the latest climate discussions. He's just, you could see physically the man is barely keeping it together. She says, but now is not a time for a protest vote. So when is the time for a protest vote, Michelle? When are we allowed to protest? Or not this next election too, right? Because every election, according to them, is a time you have to sacrifice your values and your instinctual radar that these guys aren't leaders. These guys aren't good people. They say, stop though. The other side is worse. The other side, and that there's a lot of power politics all use the same dynamic. Lesser of two evils, inducement through fear, asking you to ignore your humanity in order to just, so it's just subjugation through fear, and then distractions, of course, too, because through all of this, the surface layer is pageantry, right? And so we have Barack Obama congratulating Jay-Z on his induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? Because first and foremost, he's a brand. And that brand is beautiful. When you scratch the surface, it becomes very ugly underneath. So that being said, let's do Reading the Times for Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. Leaders warn of climate doomsday as old rifts divide summit's first day. World leaders opened a pivotal climate summit in Scotland on Monday with apocalyptic warnings. Oh, there's the fear about the scarce time left to avert catastrophic global warming, yet offered few commitments to more aggressively cut greenhouse gas emissions. Leaders of developing countries reminded the summit, for example, that poor nations have yet to receive the $100 billion in annual climate aid by 2020 that was once pledged. Mr. Biden's domestic struggles have not gone unnoticed by leaders and activists all over the world, especially in light of the U.S. history of abandoning global climate efforts, most notably the Paris Accords, which the Obama administration signed, the Trump administration abandoned, and the Biden administration rejoined. Varshini Prakash, executive director of the Sunrise Movement, a youth-led climate change nonprofit, called the president's exhortation to other nations to cut emissions humiliating, given his failure to pass climate legislation at home. Mr. Biden tried to cast the United States as a leader, and his aides sought to turn international climate ire toward China. At the United States Summit Pavilion, the White House Domestic Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy, said she believed the world grasped America's legislative struggles and expressed confidence a bill with strong climate provisions would be passed. Even as Biden pushes clean energy, he seeks more oil production. President Biden told a global climate summit on Monday that we only have a brief window before us to reduce the emissions from burning oil, gas, and coal that pose an existential threat to humanity. A recent International Energy Agency report found that countries must immediately stop new oil, gas, and coal development if they hope to keep the average global temperature from increasing 1.5 Celsius above pre industrial levels, the threshold beyond which scientists say the Earth faces irreversible damage. It's not credible to say you're fighting for 1.5 degrees while you're calling for increased oil production, with gasoline prices rising above $3.30 a gallon nationwide. Mr. Biden over the weekend urged major energy producing countries with spare capacity to boost production, part of a larger effort to pressure OPEC countries and Russia to increase the supply of oil. We currently do not have adequate alternative energy sources. Mr. Biden's legislative agenda seeks to speed the migration away from oil in several ways. Some energy analysts agreed, saying that while the timing of Mr. Biden's request for increased oil production may be awkward, doing so reflects economic reality. Yes, yes, of course. We always have to do things that are bad for ourselves, bad for the environment because of the economic reality. Translation: profits. In its roadmap detailing how to slash global carbon dioxide emissions by mid century, the International Energy Agency urged ending sale of new gasoline powered vehicles by 2035, phasing out by 2040 power plants that burn coal, oil, and gas without capturing their emissions, and creating a global energy sector based largely in renewables by 2050. Supreme Court hints that it may allow challenge to Texas abortion law. After almost 3 hours of lively arguments on Monday at the Supreme Court, a majority of the justices seemed inclined to allow abortion providers, but perhaps not the Biden administration, to pursue a federal court challenge to a Texas law that has sharply curtailed abortions in the state. Justice Barrett said the law was structured to prevent the providers from presenting a full constitutional defense. A decision to allow challenge would not conclude the case or address whether the law itself is constitutional. Defenders of the Texas law have invoked a 1908 Supreme Court decision, Ex parte Young, that appears to bar lawsuits to restrain state courts. For her part, Justice Barrett took issue with the state's assertion that providers could adequately challenge the law by violating it, getting sued, and defending themselves by arguing that the law is unconstitutional. The law does allow the defendants to argue that the law has imposed an undue burden on the right to abortion, drawing on language from the Casey decision. The court's two most recent precedents on abortion, she said, allowed courts to consider the law as a whole and its deterrent effect. Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr., who has been the majority in September, said he does not see how the Supreme Court could allow suits against clerks in state courts. What does it mean to be a New York Democrat these days? President Biden is in the White House, and the center left politics that propelled his campaign have been embraced by the new governor, Kathy Hochul, and the likely next mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. You do have Eric Adams getting elected in New York City, and you have a socialist like India Walton getting elected in Buffalo, right in Governor Hochul's backyard. New York is in the midst of finding itself. The most consequential New York election this year is the race for mayor of the nation's largest city, which will be decided on Tuesday, as Mr. Adams competes against Curtis Sliwa, the Republican founder of the Guardian Angels. Jumaine D. Williams, the New York City public advocate, who formed an exploratory committee for governor, has campaigned for Miss Walton and urged other Democrats to endorse her, as New York's U.S. senators have, even as other party leaders have stayed out. Letitia James, the state attorney general who has closer ties to New York's institutional left, is challenging her as others, including Bill de Blasio, the New York City mayor, may jump in too. If the two Democrats, presumed to be the most powerful leaders in New York, are considered relative moderates, that hardly reflects the entirety of New York's incoming leadership. In New York City, there are signs that the likely next comptroller, some presumptive city council members, the public advocate, and possibly the likely new Manhattan district attorney will be the left of Mr. Adams on key issues, setting up potential battles on how to create a more equitable education system, the power of the real estate industry and big business, and the role of the police in promoting public safety. How car shortages are putting the world's economy at risk. Oh, the economy, fuck the people, but protect the economy. The world is going to be depopulated of all of humanity, but we will have industry still running. In Japan, home of Toyota and Nissan, parts shortages caused exports to fall by 46% in September compared to a year earlier, a potential demonstration of the car industry's importance to the economy. Used car prices are skyrocketing because of a lack of new cars. Car factories like the Stellantis factory in Ontario are often the biggest private sector employers in their communities, making shutdowns all the more devastating. People don't buy used People don't buy new cars or book expensive vacations. They're too worried. Opel plans to maintain all its German factories, including the one in Eisenach. Uwe Hotgutschert, the chief executive of Opel, told the Frankfurter Allgemeine, these German words, told the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung on Sunday. Slovakia, with only 5.4 million people, is home to large Volkswagen, Peugeot, and Kia factories, and produces 1 million cars a year, more per capita than any other country. They produce one car per 5 people. That's interesting. Semiconductor makers have promised to increase supply, but building new factories takes years, and car companies are not necessarily the most important customers behind the technology giants. Democrats' bill would cover poor uninsured adults up to a point. A former home health care aide, she lost coverage when she got divorced 2 years ago. Too poor to qualify for subsidized private insurance through the Obamacare exchanges, yet not poor enough for Medicaid. They navigate a Byzantine system of charity care and often skipped care altogether. The framework announced last week by President Biden for the $1.85 trillion social policy bill includes the biggest expansion of healthcare since the Obama era health law, patching holes in the landmark law that has long seemed impossible to fix. Volunteer doctors provide primary care at the clinic, but Nedra Forston, a nurse practitioner and the clinic's executive director, said that it was difficult to refer patients to specialists because so many refuse to offer free care. The Affordable Care Act intended for states to expand Medicare to cover adults with income up to 138% of the federal poverty line, currently about $17,800 a year for an individual. Miss Davis, the former home health care aide, pays $90 out of pocket to see a primary care doctor once a year and get annual mammograms from the county health department when they are free. They just started using a leaf blower outside. I'm sorry for the background noise. It's the weekend. I'm learning the schedule over here. In the first of hopefully a bigger studio with money. Oh, I forgot to ask people for money. But the ways to help spread the word: give me $1 on Venmo, give me $5, I'll give you a sticker, or go to my website, tembonepress.com, www.tenbonepress.com, Tembone Press. There's 2 books right now I'm trying to sell. Tao de Shaz, that's TaoTeshazz.com, and Good Barracks, GoodBarricks.com. Tao de Shaz, Good Barracks, the 2 books I'm trying to sell. You can reserve them for $40. You don't pay now, just enough people reserve them. I'll put in the order to print. That's how we're going to create money to start this revolution. Okay. Leaf blowers. It's okay. This is all a learning process. Long walk from freedom. Indebted Gazan trudges to jail 17th time. Or 18th. Mr. Al Garoshi, a 29-year-old plasterer, began the walk back to jail as his niece and nephews were preparing their bags for school. Mr. Al Garoshi took out a loan to pay for his wedding in 2019 and now regularly endures stints in police jail because, unemployed like his father and brother, he cannot repay the debt. If, like Mr. Al Garoshi, they fail to repay it, they usually end up in jail, the result of a 2015 law, which makes it even harder for them to reduce their debt. On the September morning when he returned to jail, Mr. Al Garoshi stepped out into his landing, still holding his 1-year-old daughter, Dina. Stuck in Gaza since the blockade began, Mr. Al Garoshi, like most Gazans, have never seen the mosque in person. At times in jail, Mr. Al Garoshi admitted he even forgets what Dina looks like. Wow. So in occupied Gaza Strip, you go to jail for not paying debts. So they've reverted back to pre-revolutionary France. After violent standoff, Pakistan strikes deal with banned Islamist group. Pakistan averted a political showdown on Monday as officials reopened a key national highway that supporters of a militant Islamic group had occupied for days, following a secret pact between the government and the group. Days-long face-off with members of TLP said that left four police officers. This is so loud. It's okay. Left four police officers dead. The Pakistani government announced Sunday that it days-long face-off with members of TLP that left four police officers dead. The Pakistani government announced Sunday that it had entered into an agreement with the group, but did not disclose the terms publicly. Many of the group's supporters remained on the national highway, hoping to pressure the government to follow through on the promises made in the agreement. In exchange, the government agreed to release members of the group who had been imprisoned and not bring new charges against the group's leader. It's a niche group with strong grassroots appeal in Pakistan's major population centers, and it's capable of leveraging that support both on the streets and at the ballot box. Mr. Razul, the constitutional lawyer, said, "The state of Pakistan, in partnership with moderate clerics, must find a concerted narrative of nonviolence against the events of blasphemy. Sunni Muslims, especially of the Barelvi sect, who make up a majority of Pakistan's population, view depictions of the Prophet Muhammad as blasphemous." In a briefing late Friday at the country's spy agency headquarters in Islamabad, senior security officials and cabinet members told a group of journalists, including the New York Times, that the state could not allow an armed group to challenge its rule. Nigeria, building collapses, killing at least 5, with many more trapped inside. A 21-story building under construction crumbled on Monday in Lagos, Nigeria's financial capital and Africa's largest city, leaving what workers said were as many as 100 construction workers trapped and at least 5 dead in the latest structural failure in a rapidly expanding metropolis. The collapse occurred at about 2 p.m. in the upscale neighborhood of Ikoyi, where construction is booming. In a country where building materials are often of poor quality and construction standards are poorly enforced, according to experts. 2 workers at the scene told Reuters that 100 people were likely working at the site when the building gave way. In the Ikoyi neighborhood on Monday, video posted on social media and aired by local news media showed that the building's floors had collapsed onto one another like many layered sandwiches. In 2016, at least 34 people were killed in the Lekki district in Lagos State when a building under construction collapsed. In 2013, at least 7 were killed after a 3-story building in the low-income Ebute Metta neighborhood in Lagos collapsed. Biden administration moves to limit methane, a potent greenhouse gas. The Biden administration said Tuesday it would heavily regulate methane, a potential greenhouse gas that spews from oil and natural gas operations and can warm the atmosphere 80 times faster than carbon dioxide in the short term. In addition to the rule proposed by the EPA, the U.S. Department of Transportation introduced a regulation to reduce methane leaks from natural gas pipelines, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced that it would work with farmers and ranchers on ways to reduce methane from livestock. An odorless, colorless, flammable gas, methane is produced by landfills, agriculture, livestock, and oil and gas drilling. Senator Shelley Moore Capito, Republican of West Virginia, criticized the methane regulations, saying they demonize an industry that is part of the lifeblood of our economy. Huh? There's that economy again. People are dying. The world is being destroyed, but the economy is becoming a cult. The oil and gas industry is divided over the methane regulations. We got out. Other people still live with this. I'd like to see them actually shut down. The oil and gas industry is united against a separate effort in Congress to impose a fee on methane leaks from oil and gas wells as part of a broader budget bill. Ann Bradbury, chief executive of the American Exploration and Production Council, which represents oil and gas companies, said, "This new, poorly constructed natural gas tax on top of regulatory costs being imposed through compliance with forthcoming EPA methane rules would be additional costs and punitive taxes that would disadvantage American producers. increase America's energy costs and cost 90,000 jobs lost across the country. She called the EPA regulatory process the appropriate way to address methane emissions in the U.S. methane regulations have fractured. Oh, anyways, they would be the appropriate way to address methane emissions. Methane regulations have a fractured history in Washington. Egypt poised to expand security powers of president and military. Egypt is poised to expand the national security powers of the president and military with legislation that will strengthen the hand of the country's authoritarian government, just as it had appeared to relax its grip last week with the lifting of a long-standing state of emergency. While some rights advocates welcomed the change, many criticize the government's moves to address human rights concerns as merely a public relations stunt, particularly as the amendments gave the president and military some powers similar to those they held under the now lifted state of emergency. With the amendments to the terrorism law, Egypt will continue to widen the role of the military, which has seen its star rise and responsibilities expand into a range of areas, from pasta manufacturing and hotels to the judiciary. Since Mr. El-Sisi, a former general, took power after the military coup in 2013. If the president approves the changes, the military and police will have permanent responsibility for protecting public infrastructure, essentially handing them control of facilities including gas pipelines, oil fields, power stations, roads, bridges, and railway tracks. We are not against toughening the penalty for disclosing military secrets or espionage, but we have reservations about the timing, as it coincides with the president's abolition of the state of emergency and the issuance of the human rights strategy, said one lawmaker, Maha Abdel Nasser of the Egyptian Social Democratic Party, according to the Egyptian news outlet Al Sharok. Miss Abdel Nasser, no, it's a woman. Maha is a woman. Miss Abdel Nasser pointed out that the strengthened penalties for publishing information about the military contradicted the national human rights strategy, which promised Egyptians the right to freedom of expression. How much are countries pledging to reduce emissions? These charts, messed up. These charts illustrate how emissions are projected to change through 2030 under current climate policies, how much each country has promised to curb its emissions, and what would be needed to limit total global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, a goal that many leaders and scientists increasingly say is necessary to avoid the worst effects from heat waves, droughts, and wildfires, as well as flooding. India, for its part, has not yet formally set a date for when its emissions will peak, with officials arguing that the country is still much poorer than other major emitters and needs more time to develop its economy. There it is again. We would love to save the world, but we have to worship the economy. The country has announced goals for increasing the use of cleaner energy sources like solar power and slowing its growth in fossil fuel consumption, but it has asked for assistance from wealthier countries to accelerate its efforts. Under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, countries are free to set their own national goals for tackling global warming. If countries all follow through on the current near-term pledges, the world could potentially limit warming to roughly 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100, according to Climate Action Tracker. At the Glasgow summit, diplomats are expected to discuss ways to accelerate climate action, whether by more deeply slashing greenhouse gases like methane, providing financial aid to developing countries for clean energy, or strengthening programs to protect forests. Desperate for housing options, communities turn to ballot initiatives. As a number of experts have concluded, home sharing has little impact on housing affordability and is not a factor in housing supply, said Sam Randall, a spokesman for Airbnb. Progressive groups say many of the housing measures are a test run for worker-friendly initiatives in 2022 that will focus on housing, wages, and other labor issues. Economic justice in general has kind of risen up during the pandemic and put a spotlight on the issue that folks are dealing with in order to afford to live with dignity. Many initiatives were indeed prompted by residents weary of the housing hunt. The housing shortage in Leadville, Colorado, squeezes all the little people that hold this town and country up, said Jenny David, 43, a seamstress who joined the Lake County Housing Coalition, which is leading the initiative to increase taxes on tourists. Miss Hall, a Democrat, said she opposed the initiative because it goes too far. It would most likely impact high-end homes instead of helping those in search of cheaper houses. Critics say tax levies and even state and federal budget increases for housing as critics are seeing tax levies and even state and federal budget increases for housing as failing to address other structural problems that have affected the housing market. A record number of Black women run some of the biggest U.S. cities. Even as more cities have elected Black women as mayors, other executive government positions for which mayorships of major cities have traditionally been stepping stones have remained out of reach. Only 2 Black women have ever been elected to the Senate, and with the election of Kamala Harris as the nation's first Black, female, and Asian American vice president, a triple bingo score. There are currently no Black female senators in office. Mr. Austin sees the increasing number of Black female candidates from these positions as encouraging nonetheless. Once in office, Black female mayors recounted how they've often found themselves continuing to battle the same stereotypes that made it so difficult for them to secure their positions in the first place. Historically, we know that Black mayors were first elected in majority Black cities. There's definitely a sisterhood there, said Miss Jones of St. Louis, adding that seeing strong Black women leading major cities bolstered her resolve in her own campaign. As Youngkin tries to finesse Trump, McAuliffe conjures his comeback. Mr. Youngkin, for his part, was aiming to redefine how Republicans could win elections with former President Donald J. Trump out of the White House. A former private equity executive, Mr. Youngkin embraced Mr. Trump during the primary contest this year, but spent the months since winning the Republican nomination keeping a rhetorical distance. While Mr. Youngkin never mentioned Trump in his 22-minute speech, he touched on several of the former president's themes and deployed some of his catchphrases. The media, Mr. Trump said in a statement earlier in the day, was trying to create an impression that Glenn Youngkin and I are at odds and don't like each other. He said that was untrue. We get along very well together and strongly believe in many of the same policies. Still, Mr. Youngkin let it be known that he was too busy campaigning to attend the Trump call-in. During his closing rally in the parking lot of a Fairfax brewery, Mr. McAuliffe said Mr. Trump's name 13 times in his 15-minute speech, repeatedly tying him to Mr. Youngkin. Donald Trump wants to win here tomorrow night so he can the next day announce for president of the United States of America. But we're going to put an end to Donald Trump's future plans right here in Virginia, Mr. McAuliffe told the crowd, which began a chant of, "Terry! Terry!" I've beaten Trump twice in Virginia. Tomorrow, we go 3-0. Mr. McAuliffe's strategy of tethering Mr. Youngkin to Mr. Trump has not stopped his lead in the polls from evaporating. Another way to put that is his strategy of tethering his opposition to Mr. Trump has failed. What to watch in Tuesday's election, Virginia's mayor races and polling. Voters in many American cities will choose the next mayor, and some will weigh in on the hotly contested ballot measures, including on the issue of policing. Big mayoralties, Boston, Buffalo, Atlanta, and more. It is not the biggest city with mayor's race on Tuesday, but the City Hall ballot in Buffalo, New York, may be the most fascinating. In New York City, Eric Adams, a borough president of Brooklyn and a Democrat, is expected to win the mayor's race and has already fashioned himself as a national figure. In Miami, Mayor Francis Suarez, a rare big city Republican mayor, is heavily favored to win re-election and is lined up to become the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, giving him a national platform. Policing is a key issue not only in the Buffalo mayor's race, but also in mayoral contests in Seattle, Atlanta, and in Cleveland, where an amendment that would overhaul how the city's police department operates is on the ballot as well. The mayor's race in Cleveland put Justin Bibb, a 34-year-old political newcomer, against Kevin Kelly, the city council president. That's interesting. Someone who's 34 running for mayor of Cleveland. There's other young people running, I'm only 39 myself. India Walton, India Walton, that's someone's name, India Walton. India Walton beat Byron Brown in Buffalo. He's back with a rubber stamp. First elected in 2005, Mr. Brown, 63, is currently running a write-in campaign against India Walton, a self-described Democrat socialist, who stunned the political world in June by winning the Democratic primary here. Miss Walton, a registered nurse, made India Walton. I should see doing this daily. I'm going to get to know these people. Said so. A registered nurse, India Walton, made her run is making her first run for public office, saying Mr. Brown, a former leader of the state party, has done little to benefit regular Buffalo residents in her 4 terms, favoring instead deep-pocketed developers who have built a series of projects along the city's Lake Erie waterfront. She's been assisted in making that argument by groups like the Working Families Party, which has regularly opposed moderate Democrats like Mr. Brown in favor of a younger and more progressive candidate like Miss Walton, whose campaigns are often invigorated by social justice issues. During the early voting period, which ended Sunday, the Brown campaign also set up voter education stations near polling locations to offer guidance on how to write in Mr. Brown's name. The vigor of Mr. Brown's write-in campaign stands in stark contrast to a seemingly ambivalent primary bid when he refused to debate Miss Walton or truly acknowledge her challenge, apparently assuming that his name recognition and 16 years in office would carry the day. Officials will not be able to declare a winner on Tuesday unless Miss Walton wins a majority of votes, said Jeremy Zellner, the chairman of the Erie County Democratic Party and a supporter of Miss Walton, who also serves as the Democratic commissioner of the Eric County Board of Elections. Manchin raises doubts on safety net bill, complicating path to quick victory. The substance of his remarks were not considerable. He has raised concern for months about the fiscal and economic impact of the social policy bill, and other lawmakers have echoed his desire to see its full text and official cost before supporting it. Mr. Manchin's tone revived some fears among House Democrats that his vote may not be winnable. Mr. Biden privately assured House Democrats last week that his outline had the backing of the Senate's 50 Democrats and independents. You don't want to keep throwing up roadblocks. If you do, it'll never be passed, said Senator John Tester, Democrat of Montana, who helped negotiate the infrastructure bill. Asked if liberals had made the mistake of in opposing a planned vote on the bill last week, Mr. Tester said, "Of course, but I think Joe made a mistake today by going out and making the news conference." Mr. Manchin found fault not only with the overall price tag, but the way the bill is structured. Representative Scott Peters, Democrat of California, whose legislation had served as a template for the discussion between Ms. Sinema and the White House, said that while Democrats might be disappointed about the failure of their decades-long push for broader government negotiations over drug prices, his plan would make a difference for consumers. Biden promised to fix home health care for seniors. Much more help may be needed. For millions of Americans, finding reliable and affordable assistance to stay at home instead of moving into a nursing home where COVID-19 killed tens of thousands of people has never seemed more urgent. We're going to expand services for seniors so families can get help from well-trained, well-paid professionals to help them take care of their parents at home, to cook a meal for them, to get their groceries for them, to help them get around, to help them live in their own home with the dignity they deserve to be afforded, Mr. Biden said on Thursday. What does Mr. Biden know about dignity, right? Will the amount in the current plan be enough? Supporters say the new health care money would shift Medicaid's this decades-long bias away from the nursing home care. The $150 billion does represent a significant influx of funds, but there are limits, he said. Once you start to do the math, the dollars don't go as far as you'd like. States are required to use Medicaid funds to cover nursing home care, but states have considerable leeway under federal regulations to decide how much should be allocated to provide home and community-based services. Medicaid, a federal state program that is the primary source of coverage for long-term care, spends about $114 billion a year on these home and community-based services, representing well over half the overall spending on long-term care. Medicare, the federal insurance program for older and disabled adults, does not cover long term care, and it limits the kind of home care people can receive. NY cabbies stage hunger strike for more aid. We're not backing down. An influential group of drivers is now urging recipients not to accept the city's help, pressing for a more ambitious and expensive bailout in a fight that has escalated into a hunger strike. Mr. de Blasio, whose relief efforts recently began handing out modest grants to help drivers negotiate with lenders to reduce their loans, has not budged from that plan, despite pressure from the city's entire congressional delegation and Senator Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, to increase the assistance. During the bubble, the city exempted the industry from regulations and filled budget gaps by selling new medallions and running ads promoting them as an investment that was better than the stock market. After a 2019 series in the New York Times revealed that the exploitative lending practices, a flurry of propo- after the New York Times revealed their exploitative lending practices, a flurry of proposals emerged to help the drivers, including a $500 million plan from a city task force and the threat of an $810 million lawsuit from the state attorney general, Letitia James, who wanted to give the money to the drivers. The city has argued that because of the crisis, lenders are eager to agree to reduce the overall loan amount in order to recoup some money from drivers who could otherwise default. For months, Ms. Desai and her supporters have been pushing their own proposal, which calls for all lenders to agree to lower all medallion loans to $145,000 in return for a guarantee from the city that it will pay for any driver who defaults on a loan. In September, last month, for which city data in September, the last month for which city data is available, there were 50% fewer cabs operating than before the pandemic, and the industry made 52% less revenue, according to the data. Supreme Court tries to tame unruly oral arguments. After 2017 study showed that female justices were disproportionately interrupted by their male colleagues and by male lawyers, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. took action, Justice Sotomayor said in a video conversation last month at New York University Law School. In the case In the case of that study, I think it has an enormous impact. I know that after reports of that finding came out, that our Chief Justice was much more sensitive. Chief Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, she said, started playing referee when interruptions happened and ensuring that people got back to the judges who were interrupted. Justice Thomas is also no fan of interruptions, saying that lawyers arguing before the court should be allowed to make their case without being bombarded with questions. It's the biggest change to oral arguments since I've been following the Supreme Court, said William M. J., a Supreme Court specialist at Goodwin Proctor. And I've been an appellate lawyer for 20 years. The justices also appear to have agreed among themselves to let Justice Thomas ask the first question during the main part of the arguments. And he did so almost without exception in the 9 arguments the court heard in October. It's healthy, he said, that we're spending an extra 6 minutes or so per advocate and getting quite a few extra questions, quite a few extra lines of questioning, and a more part and more participation by a larger number of justices, including, of course, Justice Thomas, who has been the third most active user of extra time. Justice Neil M. Gorsuch was first by a lot, and Chief Justice Roberts was second. Without question, before the study came out, I without question before the study came out, but I don't know of a woman who hasn't. Regrettably, that is the dynamic that exists, not just on the court, but in our society in general. Most of the time, women say things and they're not heard in the same way as men who might say the identical thing. It used to happen, I noticed, with great frequency to Justice Ginsburg. Justice Sotomayor said in 2009, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died last year, told Joan Biskupic, then of USA Today, that she sometimes felt ignored at the justices' private conferences. Jurors who convicted Derek Chauvin are identified for the first time. More than 6 months after a jury found the former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin guilty of murdering George Floyd, the identities of the 12 jurors whose verdict sent Mr. Chauvin to prison were released on Monday for the first time. They're scared of the unknown and of becoming a public figure instead of spending their lives in peace. At the home of one juror, less than 2 miles from where Mr. Chauvin knelt on Mr. Floyd's neck, a sign was taped to the door that said, "Please, no press, no soliciting." A Black Lives Matter poster was displayed prominently in the window of the home. Accounts have differed on how many people leaned toward voting guilty right away. Mr. Mitchell said that the 11 jurors were initially ready to convict on a murder charge, and one was unsure, while another juror said last week that as many as 5 had been initially unsure. In an interview with several jurors that aired on CNN last week, one said she had been swayed by the fact that Mr. Chauvin had not provided aid to Mr. Floyd, as he pinned him to the ground with his knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The court on Monday also released responses to questionnaires that were sent to hundreds of prospective jurors before lawyers for both sides whittled down the pool to 12 jurors, as well as 2 alternate jurors who sat through the trial but did not deliberate or vote on the verdict. The questionnaires reveal a diverse range of opinions from the jurors who were from throughout Hennepin County and ranged in age from their 20s to their 60s. 4 of the jurors were black, 6 were white, and 2 were multiracial. Not multi-racist, but multiracial. 7 of the 12 were women. Robert Durst charged with second-degree murder in his wife's disappearance. Chip Lewis, a Houston criminal defense lawyer who represented Mr. Durst at trials in Texas in 2003 and Los Angeles in 2021, called the new charge fake news. But Mr. Durst has acknowledged that he was violent towards his wife on the night of her disappearance. The jury in that case found that Mr. Durst had shot Miss Berman in the back of her head because he feared she was about to reveal to investigators what she knew about the disappearance and murder of Kathy Durst. Many of the prosecution witnesses in Los Angeles are likely to show up in Westchester, including Mike Struck, the now retired detective who first got the case. Karen Minutello, the building manager who said that Mr. Durst threw out Miss Durst's textbooks and other belongings days after she disappeared, medical school classmates in whom Miss Durst confided her fears about her husband's violence, and Miss Durst's sister, Mary, and her husband, Tom, who discovered the so-called dig note in a wastebasket in the South Salem College. Fadwa Najami, one of the last people to see Miss Durst alive, testified in Los Angeles that Miss Durst had shown up at her family's house in Connecticut before she disappeared, and Mr. Durst had phoned them asking her to come home. Ruth Mayer, who lived next door to the Durst in 1982, says she was fond of Miss Durst and has long felt an obligation to do whatever I can do. On Sunday morning, when Miss Durst was last seen, Miss Mayer brought her a hat to fend off the icy temperatures, she said. An elevator operator at their penthouse apartment in Manhattan reported seeing Miss Durst and a woman who identified herself as Miss Durst, but who police came to believe was Susan Berman, called Miss Durst's medical school to say she was ill. Okay. Jurors for Kyle Rittenhouse trial are swiftly selected. A large number of prospective jurors, about 150 people, were summoned on Monday to the Kenosha County Courthouse downtown, a reflection of the outsized attention the trial has attracted in a city that was torn by civil unrest and gun violence last year. Is there anybody who hasn't read or not heard anything about this case? Okay, Judge Bruce Schroeder of Kenosha County Circuit Court determined to select a jury rapidly, questioned potential jurors closely about their bias and their connections to the expected witnesses in the trial. Judge Schroeder, known for his loquacious and occasionally cranky courtroom manner, talked to the jury pool about their responsibility as jurors, offering commentary on judicial bias, the history of democracy, and the fall of Rome. One woman said her husband had such strong feelings about the Rittenhouse case that serving on a jury whose decision went against his view meant, she said in a quavering voice, she would not want to go home. Thomas Binger, a prosecutor, asked the potential jurors if they had given money to Mr. Rittenhouse's defense fund, or if they or their family members had participated in demonstrations in August, and if they agreed that human life was more valuable than property. Do our leaders agree that human life is more valuable than property in America? Corey Cherafisi, a lawyer to Mr. Rittenhouse, questioned prospective jurors about the positions on guns and gun ownership, if they had connections to the civil unrest in Kenosha, and whether they had emotional responses to it. Some prospective jurors voiced fears of serving on the jury and eventually disappointing or enraging the public with their verdict. Coffee always Coffee always makes me phlegmy. I'm sorry about that. We'll see. We'll figure this out, Shaz. What we're watching on election day and movie night. Gail Collins. Brett, I've had a lot of fun conversations with you, mainly, of course, because of the intellectual stimulation. Gail. McAuliffe appears to be in trouble because of a remark he made in a debate, saying that parents shouldn't be telling schools what they should teach. Brett. A politically boneheaded remark that might cost him the election. Gail. Parents being worried about what their kids are being taught is hardly new. What do you think of the ballot initiative in Minneapolis to replace the police department with something called the Department of Public Safety? Gail. Minneapolis has a dreadful police community crisis after George Floyd was murdered in such a slow and painful manner for all the world to see. Gail, the initiative in Minneapolis goes way beyond a name change, and I'm not sure it's got the public support necessary to pass on the ballot. Speaking of taxes, what do you think Democrats will succeed? Speaking of taxes, do you think the Democrats will succeed in their efforts to tax billionaires on their unrealized gains? Gail, well, it's got a better chance than my all time favorite, giving Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices. Would Russia or China help us if we were invaded by space aliens? Oh, this is Thomas Friedman. That's great. So, well, always the intellectual, Thomas Friedman. Neither China's President Xi Jinping nor Russia's President Vladimir Putin is attending the Glasgow Climate Summit, which opens Sunday in person with President Biden and many other world leaders. Even more important, the Washington Post reported last week that some of the Chinese leaders want to resist any substantial cooperation with America on climate issues until the United States dials down its pressure on China over human rights, Hong Kong, Taiwan, trade, and a range of other issues. We've never seen this tactic before from Beijing. We'll clean our air, but only if you let us buzz Taiwan's airspace, choke off the air of freedom in Hong Kong. A senior U.S. official told me that a senior U.S. official told me there's actually a lot of division in Beijing right now on the wisdom of this sort of wolf warrior diplomatic strategy on climate, which is being pushed by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. There are definitely other Chinese leaders who want to collaborate with Washington and understand that on climate, we sink or swim. China, the United States, and Russia are respectively the first, second, and fourth largest carbon emitters. Yet, at the precise historical juncture, when unprecedented global cooperation is necessary to forestall catastrophe, unprecedented global cooperation is necessary to forestall catastrophe. The world is The world is on the brink of unconstrained geostrategic competition. Indeed, U.S. relations with Russia and China are the worst they have been since the end of the Cold War. There's never a good time for a great power conflict. A shootout between the United States and China over Taiwan, or between NATO and Russia over Ukraine, just as human made climate change is putting a gun to all of our heads, would be insane because there are 7.9 billion people on the planet today, and by 2030 there will be 600 million more. 600 million more. That means that climate change or no climate change, just having as many people to feed, house, and transport will guarantee that clean power, clean water, and clean and energy efficient buildings and cars will be the next great global discovery. Laugh at the SNL school board skit. Take your local politics seriously. Local political activism on both the left and the right harkens back to the 1950s and 60s, when suburban residents across the board, across both the ideological spectrum and the country, found an outlet for the national political concerns in their own backyards. Now, like in like in those post war years when suburbanites first turned to local government to lobby for change, Americans are recognizing that local level is where they might exert some control and influence over the political system. Despite the promise of local politics, it can seem like a troubling avenue for resolving political disputes, as the loudest and most reactionary voices can wield the power to disrupt or derail the proceedings. The strange bedfellows and intra party conflicts that come with local politics create a rare space for different coalitions to form than those in Washington, D.C. The national political parties are averse to wading into fights that pit fellow partisans against one another, so they stay away from local politics. Local politics is a place for ordinary citizens to go if they want to exert control over the political process. Whenever a viral video goes around or a chaotic local meeting, national news junkies might scoff at local politics and all its warts. Reader's farewell to Nicholas Kristof, one of a kind. While Nick had won two Pulitzer Prizes, while Nick has won two Pulitzer Prizes for the Times and has helped inform the world about some of the biggest humanitarian crises around the world, many of his columns about returning home to Yamhill have resonated with me the most. Nick is running for governor in Oregon because he wants to help all of the people in Yamhill and throughout Oregon. The citizens of Oregon will surely gain a giant of humanity if you are elected as their governor. Nick Kristof is an international treasure and the definition of what journalism can be at its very best. Thanks to the Times for giving Nick the space to contribute his particular genius to the world, while needlessly peppering blame for the nation's supply chain crisis on President Biden, who has been in office for a scant 9 months. Senator Hawley correctly noted that America must redevelop its industrial base if we are to secure our access to critical goods and begin to narrow the gaping hole of income inequality. Just as past politicians failed to note that market globalization would drain America of its well-paid factory jobs, so has Mr. Hawley failed to admit that his plan will reduce America's access to underpriced goods. I have to grab my phone because I have a time limit. I have to get out of here by a certain time, according to the powers that be. All right. The TV hit that wasn't. Impeachment, American Crime Story, a series that attracted a lot of media coverage before its September premiere, airs on FX Cable Network Tuesday at 10 p.m. Last week's episode ranked 15th in the ratings for cable shows that day, tied with ESPN's Around the Horn and MTV's Teen Mom. Produced by Ryan Murphy, American Crime Story has a lot going for it, including an A-list cast and the sumptuous production touches that Mr. Murphy's fans have come to expect of his shows. So why hasn't the show landed with viewers in a big way? Why isn't it a regular part of Twitter's top trending topics? The answer lies in the fact that American Crime Story is not available on any major streaming platform and won't be for another 10 months. For an undisclosed sum, the company sold the streaming rights to all editions of American Crime Story to Netflix. Viewers accustomed to the largely commercial-free experience of streaming would have had a flashback to the days of traditional TV while watching the most recent trying to be fast, I mess up sometimes, so. While watching the most recent episode of Impeachment, American Crime Story on Tuesday night. Impeachment, American Crime Story draws an average audience of 571,000 viewers among adults under the age of 50, according to Nielsen's delayed viewing data. The assassination of Gianni Versace, American Crime Story, has more than doubled that audience with 1.2 million, and the O.J. Simpson season has an average of 3.9 million viewers. James Staley, Barclays CEO, steps down after a Jeffrey Epstein inquiry. Mr. Gates' ex-wife, Melinda French Gates, voiced concerns about the ties between the two men in the years before she filed for divorce in May. Mr. Wexner, who was one of Mr. Epstein's early clients and a source of much of his wealth, stepped down from L Brands in May. After months of questions over his close ties to Mr. Epstein, Mr. Black stepped down as chief executive and chairman of Apollo in March, a few months after an inquiry from its board found that he paid $158 million to Mr. Epstein for tax and financial planning advice in the years after Mr. Epstein's 2008 guilt plea to a prostitution charge involving a teenage girl. The regulators declined to provide any details about what their inquiry had found, saying in a joint statement, they do not comment on ongoing investigations or regulatory proceedings. Mr. Epstein had played a crucial role in the ascent of Mr. Staley, who built a lucrative banking portfolio at JP Morgan, partly based on connections that Mr. Epstein helped him forge. The deal helped elevate the standing of Mr. Staley and the private bank and netted Mr. Epstein a multi-million-dollar referral fee for helping to broker the deal. The men were close enough that Mr. Staley visited Mr. Epstein after his conviction, meeting at the Palm Beach office where Mr. Epstein was allowed to work during his 13-month sentence. Ghislaine Maxwell, a former longtime associate of Mr. Epstein, is scheduled to go on trial this month in Manhattan federal court on charges she helped Mr. Epstein procure girls as part of his predatory sexual activity. Regulators ask Congress to create new rules for cryptocurrency. The report, which was undertaken by a President's Working Group on Financial Markets, called on Congress to pass a law that makes issuers of stablecoin subject to requirements like those of traditional bank and financial institutions. Stablecoins, which are ostensibly pegged to the value of a stable reserve asset, like the dollar, have not always proved as securely backed as companies claim, which the Treasury report warns could pose significant problems for customers, investors, and the overall financial system. Failure to act risks growth of payment stable. Let's try this again. Failure to act risks growth of payment stablecoins without adequate protection for users, the financial system, and the broader economy. More than $130 billion worth of stablecoins are in circulation, up from $28 billion in January. If Congress fails to act, the report suggests that a regulatory body created after 2008 financial crisis, known as Financial Stability Oversight Council, could step in and designate stablecoins as a potential systemic risk, immediately granting federal regulators new powers to demand changes in how stablecoins operate. Some stablecoin arrangements are already sizable, and many stablecoins are growing, the report says, detailing the risk from a potential rush by consumers to cash out of a stablecoin. A run occurring under strained market conditions may have the potential to amplify a shock to the economy and the financial system. Some industry participants view the report as both a recognition of the potential that stablecoins have to transform the payment system and the legitimacy of cryptocurrencies overall. Amazon to launch first 2 internet satellites in 2022. The Federal Communications Commission, which regulates satellite communications to the ground, approved Amazon's network in 2020 and gave the company a deadline to launch half of its 3,236 satellites by mid-2026. Amazon bought 9 launches from the rocket company United Launch Alliance in a deal likely worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Amazon has been talking to other launch companies, Mr. Badiel said, including its competitor SpaceX, whose rapid Starlink deployment is partially attributable to its ability to use its own reusable rocket boosters for launches. The first 2 prototype satellites, Kuiper Sat-1 and Kuiper Sat-2, will launch separately on rockets from ABL Space Systems, one of a handful of startups building smaller launch vehicles to sate demand from satellite companies. Past experiments involved flying drones with satellite hardware over antennas on the ground and connecting ground antennas to other companies' satellites already in space, drawing internet speeds fast enough to stream high-definition video. The feuding between the 2 companies, which sometimes spills out into the open, is linked to the broader rivalry between Mr. Bezos and Mr. Muskie, whose space companies compete for NASA and Pentagon launch contracts. PG&E says it faces a federal inquiry and $1.15 billion in losses over the Dixie Fire. PG&E, already facing criminal charges in multiple counties under state law, said the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of California served the company with a subpoena last month for documents related to the Dixie Fire, which began in July, burning almost 1 million acres. Failure to obtain substantial or full recovery of costs related to wildfires in a timely manner, or any conclusion that such recovery is no longer probable, could have a material effect on PG&E Corporation and the utility's financial condition, results of operations, liquidity, and cash flows. The utility said in the filing. PG&E filed for bankruptcy protection in January 2019 after amassing $30 billion in wildfire liability, including the state's deadliest blaze, the Camp Fire, which killed scores of people and destroyed the town of Paradise in 2018. Prosecutors in Sonoma and Shasta counties have brought criminal charges against PG&E related to the 2019 Kincaid Fire and the 2020 Zog Fire, which killed 4 people. Although PG&E has upgraded parts of its system and taken steps like intermittently shutting off customer power to prevent its equipment from causing more fires, the utility has continued to be the subject of wildfire investigations. In addition to the Dixie Fire, PG&E's equipment is suspected of causing 2 other fires this year. Rivian edges closer to IPO, seeking a valuation of $50 billion. Rivian, an electric truck maker backed by Amazon and Ford Motors, is aimed to be valued above $50 billion in its initial public offering next week. The company updated its registration documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission on Monday to say it was aiming to sell 135 million Class A common shares priced between $57 and $62 a share, raising up to $8.4 billion. Rivian is one of many startups hoping to capture a share of the electric vehicle market, which is expected to grow exponentially over the next 2 decades. Amazon has invested over $1.8 billion in Rivian, and it disclosed last week that it held a 20% stake in the company. At $62 per share, Rivian could have a value as high as $61 billion if extra shares that might get issued are counted. Rivian has lost $2 billion since the start of last year, underscoring the costs and risks of developing electric vehicles. At Saudi investment conference, Trump allies remain front and center. For many of those in attendance, the big draw was Saudi Arabia's $450 billion sovereign wealth fund, the public investment fund whose governor, Yasser Al Rumayyan, typically hosts the event. Allocating money into foreign investment funds has always been a part of Saudi Arabia's strategic toolkit. Mr. Munchin, who started, Munchin? I don't watch enough TV to know how to say that. Who started a $2.5 billion investment fund in July, has already raised money from. Started a $2.5 billion investment fund in July, has already raised money from the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. One Middle East-based financier who attended the conference but spoke on the condition of anonymity because of the sensitive topic, said the Saudi fund of Mr. Kushner's new initiative would be in line with his region's embrace of soft power. He was referring to the leverage that comes from providing financial assistance to people who are in the sphere of influence with current and former politicians and their parties. As an informal advisor to the Trump administration on the economy and on trade deals, he was present for Mr. Trump's 2017 state visit to Riyadh and announced a landmark investment deal of up to $20 billion with the Saudis during it. Another attendee, Anthony Scaramucci, the investment fund manager who served briefly as Mr. Trump's communications director at the White House, only to break with him later, said he was actively trying to raise money from Saudi investors. Keeping cattle on the move and carbon in the soil. Grasslands played a vital role in storing carbon, which in the form of carbon dioxide is a main greenhouse gas linked to climate change, and thus they serve a crucial bulwark against the rising temperatures and seas. North American ranchers, as well as women in Kenya, ecologists in Brazil, and United Nations workers in Kyrgyzstan, are part of a nascent global network fighting to save grasslands and to secure their place in global climate policies. Men make plans and God laughs, said Casey Coulter, 40, who ranches 150 miles southeast of the Oprits and is a font of aphorisms such as poor land equals poor people. The authors of a January paper in Nature Communications concluded that destruction and degradation of grasslands worldwide have already released enough greenhouse gases, including methane from herbivorous grazing livestock, to negate the cooling effect of sparsely grazed and natural grassland carbon sinks. Unlike forest, grasslands store the bulk of their carbon out of sight in deep penetrating roots. Grassland ecologists have cautioned against the egregiously counterproductive practice of blanketing grasslands with trees that may end up dying in droughts or fires, emitting carbon and destroying biodiversity twice over. Okay, now we only have 5 pandemic stories and we're done. The official global virus death toll has passed 5 million. The full count is undoubtedly higher. The coronavirus is responsible for more than 5 million confirmed deaths around the world as of Monday, according to data from the Center for Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. The pace of confirmed deaths seemed to have slowed slightly since the world reached 4 million in early July, despite the rapid spread of the Delta variant since then, a sign that the spread of vaccine could be having an impact, at least in some parts of the world. The nations with the highest reported death tolls after the United States are in order: Brazil, India, Mexico, and Russia. The global rate of reported deaths climbed over the past 2 weeks after trending downward for much of September and the first half of October, but at an average of over 7,000 per day, remain about 3,000 less than its August peak. The World Health Organization said last week in a report on pandemic conditions that confirmed deaths had increased in Europe and Southeast Asia and declined in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Dr. Nash said that the death rate appeared to be slowing in places around the world where we are doing a good job at counting death, which also happen to be places in the world that have best access to vaccines. But he concluded, I think there are places where there are increases in death rates, but we're just not measuring them. The 20 countries that have recorded the most reported death per capita in recent weeks are mostly in Eastern Europe and the Caribbean, and most of them have vaccinated far less than half their populations. 9,000 unvaccinated NYC workers put on unpaid leave as mandate begins. For the most part, New York City's vast municipal workforce returned to work as usual on Monday with more than a few sore arms and new vaccination cards, as the city's coronavirus vaccine mandate for its employees went into effect, officials said. Another 12,000 city workers had yet to get their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, but had applied for a religious or medical exemption. Since Monday's deadline for about 160,000 city workers was first announced on October 20th, more than 22,400 city employees had gotten their first dosage. Gregory Floyd, president of Teamster Local 237, which represents more than 18,000 municipal workers in New York City, said the time frame was too short to allow some people to book a doctor's appointment to discuss the vaccine. Though city agencies reported little strain on Monday, worker shortages could emerge in the coming week. About 12,000 city workers, roughly half of whom work for a police department, have applied for religious or medical exemption. How often do COVID vaccines cause heart problems in kids? While the vaccine made by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna do seem to be associated with increased risk of myocarditis, the absolute risk remains very small. An FDA scientific advisory committee, on which he sits, met last week to review the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine's safety in children 5 through 11 and ultimately voted to recommend that children be given the vaccine. Some instances of myocarditis after immunization, like those of Dr. Gustin's older sons, may be detected simply because of the intense scrutiny on vaccines, said Dr. James De Lemos, a cardiologist at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, who reported one of the first cases in January. The myocarditis linked to the vaccine is far less frequent and severe compared with observed in patients with COVID, and it does not seem to cause lasting harm, Dr. De Lemos said. It's consistent regardless of the cases we use. It's consistent regardless of which cases we use, or whether it's males only or both sexes. The risk after both doses of the Moderna vaccine in people aged 18 to 39 was as much as 37 times as high as in the general population. And the rate after two doses of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine in those aged 12 to 39 were as much as 19 times as high. The math still favors vaccination in adolescents and children. It's unclear why myocarditis seems to affect boys more than girls, and whether it is specific to the coronavirus vaccine or a side effect of all mRNA vaccines. No vaccine mandates. No, vaccine mandates aren't an attack on freedom. Multiple Republican attorney generals have filed suit to stop federal vaccine mandates. A successful vaccination campaign could mean a successful Biden administration, and the right is determined to prevent that, no matter how many avoidable deaths result from vaccine sabotage. Still, the case against vaccine mandates, however disingenuous, need to be answered on the merits. There would be strong arguments for public promotion. There would be strong arguments for public promotion of vaccines, even if we were to somehow ignore the harm the unvaccinated impose on others and only look at personal choice aspect. So you have to wonder why anyone would consider it a good idea when Florida's Surgeon General urged people to downplay medical advice on vaccines and rely on their intuition and sensibilities. Finally, the most contentious area in this whole argument involves vaccine and mask requirements for schools. That's why we have long-standing vaccine mandates for many childhood diseases. How the pandemic has added to labor unrest, the last article. Labor market leverage and the fact that workers have been thoroughly labor market leverage and the fact that workers have been through incredibly difficult working conditions over the past year and a half with the pandemic are combining to explain a lot of this labor activism now, said Johnny Callis, a PhD student and project director of Cornell's Labor Action Tracker. Many workers who are nearing a strike appear to have pulled back from the brink, including 60,000 film and television production workers, whose strike threat was at least temporarily diffused when their union reached tentative agreement with production studios. Manufacturing workers contemplating strikes may have jobs that are relatively sought after in their cities and towns, making workers less keen to risk their jobs in the event of the strike and potentially easier to fill than a quick glance at the number of local openings would suggest. Companies can use the legal system to place restrictions on them, as with Warrior Met Coal in Alabama, where about 1,000 workers represented by the United Mine Workers of America have been on strike for 7 months. No one can find workers now. Where do they think they'll find 400? Miss Glaser, the local union official, said shortly before the strike ended. The proposed contract included a commitment to largely maintain the existing overtime pay rules for current workers, though it left open the possibility that future workers would be scheduled on weekends at regular pay, which graded on union members. And that has been Reading the Times for Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. Reading the Times for Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. My name is SHAZZBARBARIC, SHAZZBARIC, SB Barrick, yours for the revolution. Signing off.